What's up, everybody? Welcome to a seminar on Earth and space science from the perspective of a global flood. This is entitled Mountains of the Great Deep, Part 4, and tonight's presentation will be on the Grand Canyon, frozen mammoths, and let me begin the presentation here. The Ice Age. The Grand Canyon, 277 miles long, up to 18 miles wide, and attains a depth of over a mile. So the delta that should hold the millions of years worth of Grand Canyon dirt and rock is relatively small compared to other deltas. The Colorado River Delta does not make the charts for the major deltas in the world, like the Ganges, Brahmaputra, or Brahmaputra. I don't know how to say that. It's a huge delta. Mississippi River Delta is significant, and the Colorado River Delta virtually doesn't even exist compared to, the rest of the deltas in the world. It's just very small, and it should be one of the largest because if, the dirt that is there, it should have came from the grandest canyon in the world to cut out this huge hole in the ground. So there should be a lot of dirt, but there's not. So there's a relatively small and insignificant delta. Now, the way that a delta forms, go back to me here for a second. The way the delta forms is a slow accumulation of sediment as a river cuts across a landscape. And so it will deposit that like near the shoreline. And so it develops into a delta. People use it for agriculture and stuff. If this Colorado River through layers of solid rock over millions of years, it should have left a massive delta, and it didn't. So where did all of it go? If it was carried out farther into the ocean, well, then that would indicate a rapid removal of all of the dirt and the rock from canyon, rather than a slow and gradual process. So that's point number one. Let's continue. It appears that the Grand Canyon, which you see down there, is the result of two massive lakes that overfilled their natural dams, and breached through them. And so it's a washed out spillway rather than, a river or multiple river systems carving it over millions of years. It was rather a, 1 or 2 month process of two massive lakes basically overflowing, and all the water was poured into that region, which carved out the canyon. So the sediment in that region had to be relatively soft. It couldn't have been hard. And so the sediment itself had to be formed in the recent past and then carved out. So I'm going to explain some things to justify that kind of at the latter part of this when we get done with the Grand Canyon section. So you have Vermilion and Echo Cliffs, and then you have a marble canyon in the midsection of that. So there's this funnel shape that is carved out there, and that's actually the beginning of these breaches where two lakes, they pour over their natural dams and work together to remove the dirt and the rock that once filled the canyon. Breach point number 1 is in the white arrow, and then number 2 is in the pink arrow, and these basically, number 1 breaches first, and then number 2 follows it. And they both act together to carve out the canyon. The fracture, which creates Marble Canyon, is actually the mantle under the crust, that was slightly uplifted, and so it created a crack in the granite rock. And that's where the water is going to create a lot of the erosion. So Journal of Rock Mechanics, Technical Engineering, Volume 10. Eddy hole type potholes are one of the most spectacular examples of clearly visible abiotic features formed on bedrock by rapidly swirling flow of water, and these have been found on the edge of Echo and Vermilion cliffs. Potholes on the edge of Echo and Vermilion cliffs is evidence that the cliff side used to be the edge of a waterfall. Michigan Technology University geologists associate potholes with large volumes of very turbulent water. So, a washed out spillway is the explanation for the canyon. The spring action mantle will try to rise. If it is suddenly relieved of pressure, it will be uplifted. So you go back to this picture right here, this funnel in between Vermilion and Echo Cliffs, Marble Canyon there, that funnel shape area is where tons and tons of sediment was rapidly excavated, relieving pressure from the mantle, allowing it to slightly spring upward and create a crack in the granite bedrock, a fracture. Here's a starting hypothesis with all that in mind. The breaching of the first lake quickly washed away millions of tons of sediment. Relief of pressure from the mantle caused the crust to crack, and the breaching of the second lake flowed under the current into the crack, and the force of the two currents carved out Grand Canyon. So if you can understand that correctly, you have breach point number one, removing all of the sediment, and then the mantle tries to spring upward, creates a crack, a fracture within the crust, and then when the second lake breaches, that will actually go into that crack, and then you'll have an undercurrent on top of the main current. And these undercurrents would help to form the barb canyons. The water from the two Great Lakes eroded the walls of this crack as the mantle was uplifted to its current position. The Colorado River, you have the top current and then the undercurrent, which is in that crack, that fracture that's been created from the breach of the second lake. It's flowing under the first current. It's probably faster, and so it's flowing under into that crack, and it erodes the walls of that crack. And so the previous pliable, uncemented layers above the limestone sank and tipped, forming a sink valley. Torrents of surface water then entered that valley, eroded it deeper, and carved from the surface down these barbed canyons in weeks. So you have these tributary canyons, which they're not tributary because they're not flowing they're opposite of the flow of the river. So and they're too much of at an angle, I think is what it is. But either way, you have these side canyons. They're called barb canyons. So the way that those were formed in this model is that the surface in that area, the dirt, the rock, it's all saturated in all of this water, and so it's basically creating currents, and they are flowing into the main current. So water is just kind of being pulled out from the sides of this fracture, flowing into the main current. And so because of the undercurrent and the top current, both working together, this is kind of what's happened. So water that is trapped in the sediment already is going to just be pulled out and flow into the main current. And that would create those side canyons. Water in this region, which is the inside of one of those barbed canyons, it rapidly flowed toward the crack and quickly removed the sediment to form the side canyons of the Colorado River, and then you have drainage into the Colorado River. The earth naturally opened because of the rising mantle, causing the crust above it to stretch, and the waters above literally poured into the crack. So the carving mostly occurred underwater, the Grand Canyon itself. So torrents of surface water entered that valley. They eroded it deeper and carved from the surface down the side canyons. Hydraulic lifting of the plateau. Sometime after the mountains were lifted in the compression event, they settled into the mantle, which acted to rise the mantle to another location affected by the depression. The crust was close to cementing into solid rock, but still soft and brittle enough to crack. As huge pools of magma developed under certain regions, they were separated into plates and uplifted far above sea level. So here's a picture of what I'm saying. You have like the Rocky Mountains, and they basically squeeze the liquid magma that's under them, and that will lift a section like a plate, a tectonic plate, in an adjacent side of the earth, squeezing it into another area and uplifting the rock that is above that. And so that creates like a plateau, that plane that is uplifted above surrounding mountains or whatever. So with this, when a plateau gets uplifted, the Grand Canyon is actually on top of the Colorado Plateau. So that's how the plateau was formed, hydrodynamically, like with the the physics acting during a global flood, during the compression event, which we covered in part 2. This forms the Colorado Plateau. And when this plateau is risen up, on top of it are these lakes. And these lakes will eventually overflow, and they will form the Grand Canyon. So as a quick timeline from creation to the present. 6,000 years ago, God made everything, approximately. 4,000 years ago, there was a flood, 4,500 years ago, there was a flood. And then maybe 3,500 years ago, you have this great melting event, okay? And it basically causes a rapid melting of the ice that is on the north and south poles, causing sea levels to rise, causing lakes to overflow. And that's why you'd have the Grand Canyon forming, where the sediment that was all deposited from a global flood is still relatively soft. And so when the lakes overflow, they're able to cut a massive canyon into the earth. The earth was covered in ice during the flood, and then the ice melted probably 1,000 years later. And so about in 2000 BC, maybe longer than 2500 BC, I would say, the earth is covered in ice on the north and south poles, but it stretches nearly to Kansas City, Missouri. Like if you're in North America, it covers mostly Europe. And then about 1,000 years after that, it would melt. And that melting is what's going to cause those lakes to overflow. Though this is according to Lindsay Williams, the Energy Non-Crisis Second Edition, though the ground is frozen for 1,900 feet down from the surface of Prudhoe Bay, everywhere the oil companies drilled around this area, they discovered an ancient tropical forest. So we're talking about a tropical forest under one of the frozen poles. I believe it's the North Pole. So it was in a frozen state, this petrified forest under all the ice. Not in petrified state. It is between 1,100, 1,700 feet down. There are palm trees, pine trees, tropical foliage in great profusion. In fact, they found them lapped all over each other, just as though they had fallen in that position. Fossil forests in New Siberian islands. There are vast floating remains of forests that have been washed up on New Siberian islands well inside the Arctic Circle, and thousands of miles from comparable forests today. Like nothing, there's no forest in that region today. There's certainly no tropical forest growing there. So there's an entire forest, though, that is under all the ice. The driftwood was washed ashore on Bolshoi Lyahov Island on one of the New Siberian islands. So when all of this ice melts, it releases all of this all of the forest material that's underneath it. According to Science Volume 104, October 2007, Richard Firestone, evidence for an extraterrestrial impact 12,900 years ago that contributed to the megafaunal extinctions and the Younger Dryas cooling. The Younger Dryas cooling is when they say that the North and South poles did they did experience a rapid melting event, which they put at 10,000 years ago. But if you stick with the biblical timeline, it puts it to 4,500 or about 3,500 years ago, approximately. I mean, if you use the days of Peleg, for instance, as a time marker, which is, I guess, not necessary, but you could use that as a time marker. We know, though, that there was a flood 4,500 years ago. So if there was some kind of a rapid icing or a rapid ice melt, had to happen sometime after the flood. So it definitely couldn't have been 10,000 years ago. And the methods that they're using to come to those dates are flawed anyway. It's called carbon dating, and it ought to be thrown in the trash. But we're not going to get into carbon dating. It's totally false, But I'll bring up one thing on carbon dating. One time they actually carbon dated a mammoth, a dead mammoth. One part of the mammoth was like, I don't know, 10,000, let's just say hypothetically, because I don't remember the numbers, but one part was like 10,000 and another part was like 100,000. So there was like two completely different ages. Their carbon dating doesn't work to push the Younger Dryas that far back. The Younger Dryas, this was relatively recent. It wasn't 10, it was more like, I would say, about 1,000 years after the flood. So let's say 3,500 BC. You can go to, let's see, Mammoth Ivory Annual Report of the Board Regents of Smithsonian Institution, 1899. They say, in that article that mammoth ivory is remarkably preserved. Exposure in their ordinary condition would speedily deteriorate the quality of the ivory. I mean, you can research this stuff. It's part of observational science. We know that the mammoths were buried quickly by ice, just the preservation of the ivory, the preservation of the food remains that were undigested in their stomach. So the entire animal had to be frozen quickly, and that would take extremely cold temperatures to do that. Evidence of plant and animal DNA along with their remains clearly reveals an ecosystem of lush vegetation and tropical animals. The world before the flood was very tropical, okay? And then the north and south poles of that world were quickly covered in ice. That is why there is a tropical forest on the north and south poles. That is why there are tropical animals in those same layers of strata, the permafrost, really, that's under all the ice. According to Science Volume 253, a recent Japanese study extracted longer strands of nuclear DNA, which showed the mammoth to be more closely related to an Indian elephant than the African elephant. So, I mean, the mammoths are elephants. Okay, they're maybe a different kind of elephant. They have wool. Maybe it's the same animal, but it doesn't matter. The point is that it's very similar to a regular elephant, which today elephants live in tropical environments. I mean, sloths live in tropical environments and they're covered in hair. But so just because it's like got hair all over it, that doesn't necessarily mean it's supposed to be living in the cold. It's got a trunk, and the trunk cannot even survive cold weather. According to H. Neuville on the extinction of the mammoth, Annual Report of Smithsonian Institution, 1919, comparative study of 350 mitochondrial DNA nucleotides indicated that the mammoth is closely related to African and Indian elephants. It is directly related, just like the woolly rhinoceros. It is an elephant. And so if it's an elephant, genetically, there's no way that it can even survive that cold of temperatures. the hair and skin of mammoths are not adapted to cold weather. You can look at this article or a book, Stuttgart, Germany. Let's see, Hans Cross, the mammoth in ice and snow, question mark, and research that and read this research for yourself, where they examined the hair of it and said that it was not wool, technically, like a wool that would be like on a sheep, or like an insulating wool on a bear, like a polar bear. It's different. It's actually just hair, like hair that grows on our heads. And it's not wool at all. It's not fur. Okay. It's just hair. Harold Lamb, Hannibal, One Man Against Rome. In that book, it's I believe it would be like a nonfiction book about Hannibal, and he actually crossed the Alps with 37 elephants, but the cold weather killed all of them but one. There's no way that an elephant can survive in cold weather with no fur, which the mammoth doesn't have, it just has hair. So it's not even possible. Their trunks are extremely delicate to the cold. The conclusion is that something suddenly froze the North and South poles in ice, and the ice retreated sometime later to its current location. Certain animals found near mammoth fossils, along with the lush vegetation, do not live in cold climates today. Many of them do, like rhinos and tigers. Geographical extent: northern portions of Asia, Europe, and North America contain the remains of extinct species of the elephant, the mammoth, the rhinoceros, together with those of horses, oxen, deer, other large quadrupeds. That was Smithsonian Exploration in Alaska, 1904. Miscellaneous Collections, Volume 49. All kinds of tropical animals in the same permafrost as the woolly mammoth. So it was in a tropical environment. The frozen mud and uprooted vegetation of the pre-flood world covered the North and South poles, along with super cold ice that rained down for 40 days and 40 nights. Permafroze, permanently freezing it. So that created the frozen poles. It says in Genesis 7:11, let me get a drink. Genesis 7:11. In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the second month, the 17th day of the month, on that day, all the fountains of the great deep were broken up and the windows of heaven were open. Notice that there are two components to this scenario of Noah's flood: the water covering the earth. One scenario is that the fountains of the great deep are breaking open, which we've discovered in detail now over the past few presentations of how the water under the crust comes up catastrophically through a rupture that is created in that granite crust. So all that water comes up. That's the fountains of the great deep, subterranean waters being relieved of their contents. Okay, all that water being released. That's the fountains of the great deep breaking up. And then you have the windows of heaven were open, it says. So is this just a typology of a lot of rain coming down from the sky? Or is this literal, like there was a solid structure that was see-through and then it was open? The Hebrew word for window indicates very clearly it's talking about a chimney, just like a window for a house. It's used, you open it to you let out hot air, like when you're cooking and stuff. And so the earth, theoretically, if it had a canopy above it, some kind of a super cold ice, upheld by the Meissner effect and the magnetic field, or possibly metallic hydrogen, something transparent and magnetically attractive that could act as a superconductor, which would have to involve super cold ice. But anyways, it's a canopy above the earth, okay, and it's acting as a chimney. It possibly has one hole at the North Pole and at the South Pole to be able to circulate air. Now, when atmospheric pressure is high, you're not going to have any clouds in the sky, which is why it didn't rain before the flood, because that canopy is there. But once you allow pressure to relieve, and there's low pressure, you're going to have an accumulation of clouds. And now the way that wind works is, that cold air is kind of being pushed out by the warm air. So when there's low pressure, this kind of creates like a vacancy in the atmosphere for warm air to rapidly rush in, and then it creates all those clouds. So that's kind of the basics of it. The canopy theory says that the atmosphere of the pre-flood Earth had a canopy of ice levitated above the atmosphere with the Meissner effect. This canopy was struck and opened at the north and south poles, and this caused the fountains to produce clouds which would condense at the point of low air pressure, the windows. So at the north and south poles, there's these chimneys, and so when all of this is happening at the flood, all of that water being released into the atmosphere, basically vapor is what it is, supercritical water far beyond the point of boiling, rapidly spraying into the atmosphere, and it's collecting into clouds, and they are collecting at the north and south poles at the low pressures. So the heat resulted primarily from the fountains, and it melted the canopy during the 40-day flood phase, or it just rapidly, or it like instantaneously just vaporized it. But I don't see it that way. I see a gradual melting of the canopy as to allow for a collection of clouds, ice, at the north and south poles. So, and then also for circulation, of air before the flood in the canopy theory, in that environment where you have insects, that have 2-foot wingspans, 7-foot long tarantulas, these man-sized centipedes, insects that, they breathe through their skin, and large amounts of oxygen in the atmosphere will allow insects to grow bigger. Decreased oxygen would generate small insects because larger ones could not get enough air. You're not going to have a massive insect in today's atmosphere because of the fact there's not enough oxygen to supply a breeze through its skin. So it's not going to be able to get that big unless you increase the oxygen. The insects are small today because of, they can't extract enough air from the atmosphere to allow them to grow to this kind of a size, which we see in the fossil record. But before the flood, if you have a canopy, it increases that air pressure, increases oxygen. This has been proven. There were several PhD scientists who wrote in this article, Mystery of Life's Origin, or this is a book, page 80 of that book. They said that the only trend in the recent literature is the suggestion of far more oxygen in the early atmosphere than anyone imagined. They were able to prove that there's 50% more oxygen in the Carboniferous era where these insects are by air bubbles that were trapped in amber. So that Carboniferous era was actually a phase during the flood where huge mats of vegetation are being rapidly buried by mud and water, then you would have the pre-flood atmosphere essentially trapped in those layers, preserved for us to study and examine today and prove a global flood happened. That's what I think that it shows. So Earth's atmosphere today has 6 layers, and before the flood, it possibly could have had a 7th. Suspended by air pressure, suspended by the Meissner effect, suspended, by the non-existence of gravity in space. So probably no ice caps, far smaller oceans, and a single ocean, mostly landmass before the flood. Whereas today, the Earth is 70% covered by water because of the flood. People ask, where did all the water go to flood the Earth? Well, just look around. Less than 50% of this planet, 15% of this planet is even habitable by man. Most of it is covered in water and ice and deserts and stuff. So, but mostly water. So the world that was covered by water was also covered by ice that at the north and the south poles, and this has created winter. So it also does some other interesting things. The tilt of the Earth is why those regions are really permanently frozen, because they don't get enough sunlight. Whereas there would have been a perfect, like it would have been upright. There wouldn't have been a tilt before the flood. So you have perfect weather everywhere with the canopy. And when it was tilted during the flood, because of the formation of the Himalayan mountains, East 90 Ridge, which we don't want to get into now, I'll do like a video dedicated to that possibly, but we won't probably get into it in this seminar. I don't know, maybe in the next one I might have some slides on that. But the Earth, the geophysics occurring in the flood would actually, let me go back to me real quick. The geophysics occurring during the global flood basically rolled the Earth. Okay, it shifted its equator so that now, the magnetically, opposed north and south poles, they're tilted. So because of that, those regions of the Earth, they're not going to get enough sunlight. They're because of that tilt. Whereas if it was upright, there would be no problem. So there's a problem with the specific location of those regions of the Earth. And that was, I believe that this was, intentionally set up, the global flood and the way that God set up the Earth, so that it would survive a global flood. And then the Earth would be a lot different. It would be cursed, because God said that he would curse the Earth. That's what he told Adam. And that was for our sakes, so that we could so that there was a limit on our multiplying, and that there was a limit on how old that we could get. People that have a lot of power and they get really old, things just stay the way that they are for a long time, as long as that person lives. And so, and they just become more evil a lot of the time. So God has limited the human lifespan. He's limited, the productivity of the Earth, just because there's so much evil in it. He wants to protect us, wants to preserve it. So the freezing of the North and the South poles occurred during the flood. Then there was a rapid melting event, probably 1,000 years after, which increased, the sea level, that rose the sea level, and then overfilled natural lakes, or overfilled lakes, which then breached over their natural dams and created massive canyons like the Grand Canyon. So thank you for tuning in. Come back Wednesday. We'll be doing the final part of the presentation on the origin of comets, meteors, asteroids, and trans-Neptunian objects. Hopefully, Iger can join that stream because he's a flat earther, and he might be able to debate with me on whether or not comets and asteroids even exist, because they think that space doesn't even exist. So that'll be interesting if he joins, and if not, that's fine. I got plenty of slides to keep us busy, so I'll see you then. If nothing else, stay in prayer. God bless America. My name is Christopher Silvius. Peace be upon you. I'm out.